At a cemetery in Hermitage, Pennsylvania, an American flag is raised to mark yet another day in which U.S. hostages are held captive.
Victory will not only be the abdication of the dynasty, but also the end of the foreign domination. And this is more important.
And if President Carter does not release the Shah?
He has to give us back the Shah.
There is a feeling building up that something's got to be done.
There's been no disavowal of U.S. indifference to torture and murder committed under the Shah's regime.
I'm well enough informed to know that I'm not being told the whole story.
This is the entire rotor assembly of one of the American helicopters that were involved in the rescue attempt. The effects of the Americans' abortive attempt to lift the hostages out of here seem to have been to make it all the more difficult to find any peaceful solution to the crisis.
The rescue operation now is not possible since the militants have moved the hostages to various places in the country.
The Carter people are very bitter. They say Iran deliberately prevented Mr. Carter from achieving his last and dearest wish, to see the hostages before he left the White House.
And I think it was his restraint and his patience which made all of this possible.
The military government's campaign against corruption is an all-out attempt to save the Shah's position as the leader of the Iranian people. But what remains to be seen is whether this is too little, too late. The key arrests during the recent week include the former Prime Minister, Mr. Hoveyda, and several of his former ministers. Mr. Hoveyda's government resigned at the end of last year at the request of the Shah. And the corruption and mismanagement of the country during his term of office is being widely blamed for the recent unrest. The problem, though, for the military is to convince the masses that the Shah himself is above suspicion for that corruption and mismanagement. And that is no easy task when the masses in Iran, who are poor and devout Muslims, have already largely rejected the Shah's leadership in favor of their exiled religious chief, Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini, now in Paris, spent most of his exile in Iraq and built up his following by distributing cassette tapes of his anti-Shah speeches throughout Iran. The bazaar in Tehran used to be festooned with pictures of Khomeini, but since martial law, both the pictures and the cassettes have disappeared. The masses in Iran have benefited little from the country's oil wealth. There are not enough industrial jobs for the people who have flocked to the cities, and agriculture is so backward that 50% of Iran's food has to be imported. In contrast, the wealthy minority have benefited enormously from oil. Originally, 1,000 families owned all the land in Iran, and today they basically control the economy. Corruption has been widespread and many fortunes made. The wealthy are westernized. The women don't wear veils and do much of their shopping in London and Paris. And as far as the impoverished masses are concerned, the man responsible for bringing so much wealth to so few is the Shah himself. In criticizing the Shah, the Muslim priests want a stricter enforcement of Islamic law and the firm relegation of women to second-class roles. In effect, more power for themselves. But they have no political stance as such. No alternative economic plan to spread the nation's wealth more evenly. And with the political opposition in Iran confused and weak, the military must see themselves as the only people capable of running the country at the moment. Jeffrey Archer, News at 10, Tehran. For years, it seemed nothing could stop Iran and the Shah getting richer on the proceeds of their oil and gas. But in the last 3 weeks, the oil workers with their strike have shown it is they who ultimately decide whether the oil will flow. The strike cut crude oil production to less than a third, and even today, when the strike is supposed to be all but over, the plants are only at half their usual output. The strike was aimed against the Shah, And as well as financial benefits, the workers demanded political freedom and an end to martial law. The workers were intimidated by their own militants and threatened by the military. On one occasion at Abadan, they tried to sit in the refinery all night and were evicted by soldiers with fixed bayonets. 10 workers were treated in hospital for flesh wounds. Protests against the Shah, his alleged corruption and his links with the West have been violent in many oil towns. After prayers in their mosques, demonstrators have rampaged through streets, burning banks and smashing liquor shops. The oil refinery at Abadan is the largest in the world and employs 6,500 workers. Hundreds of Americans and Europeans are employed in the Iranian oil fields, and some of the strikers' anger against the Shah and the West has been directed at them and their homes. The Americans and the British here say that whenever President Carter or Dr. David Owen utter statements of support for the Shah, then the oil workers take their revenge on the expatriates here, with an upsurge of threats and abuse. Only on Monday, a very senior American oil executive was firebombed on his way to work. The result of all this is that many expatriates are now sending their wives and families back to their countries of origin. Although more money and a promise to consider the workers' political grievances seems to be returning work to normal, the workers now know that they have the power to make the Shah and his military government jump, and they may well be tempted to use strike action again to try to bring the Shah's rule to an end. Jeffrey Archer, News at 10 in Iran.
To form a government, for the new government to be formed if he were to leave the country?
If he were to leave the country, he could not have to form the government because he is the one who's appointing the prime minister.
But would it
if you read the article of Constitution, then you actually has given you the answer.
Would it be easier for a new government to work and to be accepted by the people if the Shah were to leave the country?
I cannot accept that philosophy at all.
Your Majesty has been working extremely hard.
Well, I'm used to that.
Has it been a difficult and trying time for you, sir? Although the Shah himself was prepared to say nothing, it's clear from conversations with close aides that whether or not a new administration, a civilian cabinet, is formed here in Iran, that the Shah himself has no intention of leaving the country until law and order are restored. And it has also been made clear that he does not envisage an end to the monarchy in Iran.
It began just after midday when a few hundred demonstrators, and it must be emphasized that it was no more than that, began to throw a chain of burning barricades across streets throughout the city center.
Ateş, 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 ateş. مشقیه
پتوارا بیان از قصد دست بگیر آقا
There might have been tears in the eyes of the Shah as he left Iran for what could be the last time. But there was nothing but sheer delight on the faces of the demonstrators who took to the streets of the capital in their thousands to celebrate the departure of the man they have hated for so long. It must be remembered that the hurricane of noise that fills Tehran this afternoon is not just for the departure of the Shah, but for the expected arrival here of the exiled religious leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini. And the question now is whether people will follow him, as seems most likely, or whether they will follow the new government of Dr. Bakhtiar. And it is there that the seeds of the new conflict in Iran will be sown. Martin Lewis, News at 10 in Tehran.
Ayatollah Khomeini emerged from his small suburban house looking as impassive as ever, even on the day he's been waiting for during 15 years of exile. His followers were more expressive. There's always a handful of the faithful around him here. In Iran, of course, millions await him. And with that support, it's thought he could, on his homecoming, overthrow the new moderate government of Dr. Bakhtiar. The Ayatollah, frail at the age of 78, has symbolized the most militant opposition to the Shah. He's now nominated what he calls the Revolutionary Islamic Council inside Iran. And ultimately, he wants to turn the country back to a much stricter Muslim life. Women, for instance, would be required to wear chador, the traditional veil of modesty, and the priesthood of mullahs would be able to enforce severe restrictions on the use of alcohol. It's the breaking of strict Islamic rules like these which has played a part in the discontent with the westernization of Iran under the Shah. As the Ayatollah made clear this morning, the Shah leaving is only the start.
The departure of the Shah is not the final victory, but it is the preface to our victory. And I am congratulating the brave nation of Iran for this victory. We have to consider that the victory will not only be the abdication of the dynasty, this dynasty, but also the end of the foreign domination. And this is more important.
So although it's still not known when the Ayatollah will return to Iran, it is certain that he does intend to go back. And with the millions of devoted followers that he has there, it seems certain that his Revolutionary Islamic Council will increasingly dominate politics in Iran, even without the Ayatollah's presence. Derek Taylor, News at 10, Neufel-le-Château in Paris.
The people on the streets clearly believe that the Shah will not be returning to Iran, but everything that we have seen here today, laid out in such magnificent splendor on this unique visit, is clearly designed to give the impression of a man and a family who will one day be returning to their home. Martin Lewis, News at 10, in the Neovaran Palace in Tehran.
These soldiers are known as the Immortal Brigade. We were being shown the elite of the Iranian army, the men who guarded the Shah himself. The armed forces were built up under the Shah's personal direction, and their devotion to him apparently continues. The Chief of Staff has pledged that the armed forces will never stage a military coup. But doubts remain. Would the generals stand by and watch Bakhtiar pushed out by Khomeini and the millions who support his plan for an Islamic Republic? The generals have the power at their disposal. As well as the conventional weapons of war, riot equipment has been bought from Britain, and units like these have been trained in anti-subversion tactics. But the question must be, if there were a military takeover, could the soldiers ever again control Iran, so many of whose people have now come out on the streets to reject the Shah and his men? Derek Taylor, News at 10, Tehran.
رهنمای ما
24th of Esfahan Square, and it's here over the past few days that 70 or more people have been shot dead by the army. When Khomeini does come back, it's likely that the violence will continue because the government of Dr. Bakhtiar is not expected to give up without a fight. And the religious leaders now are saying that arms, weapons are being distributed amongst the people. Derek Taylor, News at 10, Tehran.
Among the things the crowd here has shouted is that the Prime Minister Bakhtiar has no following and therefore no power. Well, there can be no doubt who the one single man in Iran is who has more following than anybody else and therefore more power. It is Ayatollah Khomeini. John Suchet, News at 10 in Tehran.
Praying now prevails over training in what's left of Iran's army. In this barracks, no officers give orders. Instead, a bunch of local mullahs conduct fanatical Islamic chantings. Out of 3,000 men, only 300 have turned up for duty, a story repeated in every barracks we visited. Beyond the dwindling troops, tanks at £250,000 apiece stand driverless, and much of the other equipment is disintegrating fast. Further west, at Mahabad, there's not a single Iranian soldier under arms inside the barracks. The place is policed by local guerrillas, and fewer than 200 of the original 3,000 soldiers here have reported for duty. The tanks here are no longer under Iranian army control, and if they knew how to drive them, those same guerrillas could remove them within an hour. But despite there being so few soldiers in the bases, there are still queues of men outside local mullahs' homes complaining that even amongst those there are still Shahist elements at work. Thus, arrests, even from the small numbers that report for duty, continue. This major accused first of murder, then of rape. On a hillside out beyond his jail, men dismantle old pro-Shah slogans. The disintegration of the army is almost complete. Ayatollah Khomeini has failed to get his soldiers back into barracks. Without an army, his chances of controlling his boiling revolution grow no stronger. John Snow, ITN, Western Iran.
The Shah, with his wife and 4 children, walked across the lawns from the grounds of their private villa, accompanied by security guards. We were told they would not answer any questions. Watched by tourists from nearby hotels, the family walked up the steps from the swimming pool to pose as a group. A woman who claimed to have met the Shah in Canada startled his entourage by walking up and shaking his hand. "I just wanted to wish him good luck," she said. The Shah's children had already been down on the beach walking the family dogs, but the Shah himself, looking pale but composed, was still in a formal suit. Your Majesty, can you say how long you intend to stay here?
Well, I'm afraid not, but it's a beautiful place.
Do you expect to settle permanently here, sir?
We are visiting.
American State Department officials are said to be on the island, conferring with the Shah and his advisors. But his appearance here in the Bahamas still leaves many questions unanswered. What we still don't know is why the Shah has chosen the Bahamas for a visit, how long he intends to stay, and what his permanent future plans are. Norman Rees, ITN, in the Bahamas.
معاصری اقتصادی
Well, what we're seeing here now is more than just interesting, it's a really important development. Because back in February, the day the revolution was won was the day the army joined forces with the students. And that's exactly what's happening again.
We can fight for them.
To the death.
To the death.
If necessary, you will fight?
Yes, sir. We are fighting. Just
Iranian,
not
they're
with imperialism, America in
35 million of Iranians they're going to
west
fight.
of Iran.
And if President Carter does not release the Shah?
We're going to
Yes,
fight.
we have to fight.
We have to fight.
He has to give us back the Shah.
Or
we will fight with him.
Yes, I know. Good.
ارجمند و عزیز و مبارز خود حمایت و پاسداری کنیم.
Peace is much too important to leave to the experts.
That is
and we'd be fools
view
if
that
we
is
didn't.
shared by the entire delegation.
Well, how are the experts doing, in your opinion? How is President Carter handling this crisis?
Well, I feel very strongly that he started off very well, exercising a lot of restraint. I feel now that we're getting patience and time mixed up. We're running out of patience. We're not running out of time. We have all the time in the world. And I think it's too bad that we haven't a more wise approach to time, if you will.
And one of the things I think we have to do too is not only encourage the president to be patient, but it's the American people too.
Yes.
There is a feeling building up that something's got to be done, and we do believe, the three of us together, that patience is going to be very important, and that we have to listen carefully to what's going on over there. And we hope to encourage the people there, but then perhaps bring a message back to the United States and encourage our own people to be patient and to wait this thing out.
On the old Karaj road north of Tehran, huge transporters arrive day and night from the Iron Curtain countries, especially from Russia. It's a lifeline which will relieve any immediate pressure a Western trade blockade might put on Iran. So, down in the marketplace, the unofficial embargo already begun by America has had little effect. There are shortages of rice, for instance, but then Thailand has stepped in to sell Iran 100,000 tons of it. And the lack of grain is rapidly being made up by the Soviet Union and Australia. Luxuries, which the middle classes here are hungry for, come almost exclusively from one source: the Japanese, who've now stepped up their trade. It's oil, of course, which puts Iran in a strong position, and Japan snapped up 21 million barrels which America had refused to take. President Carter is finding that fear of losing their own supplies from Iran is making America's other allies nervous of imposing sanctions. There's another risk too. The British Embassy in Tehran has now been fortified with solid walls, and the number of resident staff is being cut right back, for fear that Mrs. Thatcher's strong words of support for America might provoke an attack. Derek Taylor, ITN, Tehran.
At the hotel where most of the American newsmen were staying, trucks were filling up with the literally tons of equipment they had brought in to cover the hostage crisis. Upstairs, American technicians put the final touches to the last reports their correspondents would send.
But for now, ABC, CBS, NBC, and the other American news organizations are wrapping up their operations here. There's nothing else they can do except comply with the expulsion order.
The TV networks had over 80 Americans working here and 60 Iranians. With 15 camera crews, their combined costs were running at £250,000 a week. In 3 months, the Americans have covered events here more exhaustively and expensively than in any similar period in the Vietnam War. Vast libraries of tapes bear witness to the unprecedented scrutiny to which they subjected developments here. In media terms, it has been the ultimate overkill for which the Iranians were never equipped to deal. The expulsion order has come as no surprise to those who now must leave. Some diplomatic observers here believe that the saturation coverage to which the American mass media subjected the hostage drama made the solving of the crisis all the more difficult. The question now is, now that the American cameras have been withdrawn, will it ease the atmosphere in which attempts have to be made to free the hostages? Jon Snow, News at 10, at the American Embassy in Tehran. From the outset, Dr. Banisadr employed an almost Western style of campaigning as he jetted to every major centre of population in the country. Heavily advertised in advance, his appearances attracted massive, almost hysterical crowds. Having lived 15 years in the West himself, he was now subjecting the Iranians who'd never before voted for a president to a ruthlessly efficient vote-catching machine. And when he came to cast his own vote in a makeshift tented booth, the same hysteria he'd produced in the campaign was stirred again. Last night, at a crowded news conference with victory assured, he spelt out his policies. He distanced himself from the illegal seizure of the diplomats at the American embassy here, but warned that America would have to compromise if they were to be freed. Philosophically, he is an Islamic socialist who survived several clashes of views with Ayatollah Khomeini during the campaign. Over the weekend at the Heart Hospital here, the Ayatollah's portrait was carried uncertainly in to witness a gathering of specialists who met to discuss the Ayatollah's state of health. The team is backed up by 2 Swiss doctors who've flown in from Lausanne. The Iranian specialist in charge, Professor Massoumi, says the Ayatollah is suffering from a kind of hardening of the arteries.
Narrowing of the blood vessels that feed the muscle of the heart.
And at this stage, there's no question of having to operate or anything to clear the arteries.
Well, operation would be considered in a patient who fails to respond to the treatment. Fortunately, Imam has not failed to respond. In fact, he has done remarkably well.
But with the Ayatollah ill at this moment, and with Dr. Banisadra's victory so resounding, the new president is potentially invested with considerable power. Initially, it is at the American embassy that it is likely to be first tested. The US hostages, now in their 86th day of captivity, are no longer of public interest here. No one turns up to chant, and the students holding them are becoming tired and isolated. In the past few days, it's become permissible openly to criticize the students. Their discomfort inside the embassy compound here is growing. What people are waiting to see now is whether Iran's first president can translate this pressure against the students into a movement to release the hostages. Jon Snow, News at 10, Tehran. Canada's embassy here was locked and shuttered this morning, but there was no indication of the final departure of the Canadians and their American guests. Iranians outside told us they'd been asked yesterday to come back for visas today, a sign that the Canadians had gone to some lengths to protect the secret of their evacuation. That there had been Americans here inside the embassy was a complete surprise to members of Iran's Revolutionary Council,
The Foreign Minister, Mr. Godsedeh, was first disbelieving and then furious when we asked for his reaction tonight. I spent this morning inside the American embassy here with the students who are holding the diplomats hostages there. At that stage, the students had no inkling of what had happened. Tonight, when I spoke to them, they were confused, suspicious, and angry. The Canadians appear to have decided that this was the best moment to get their Americans out. There has been virtually no public interest in the hostage drama here recently. The students in the embassy have become isolated and tired, and there's been far more concern for Ayatollah Khomeini's health and for the election of the new president. Nevertheless, this dramatic escape is bound to refocus attention on the hostage crisis, and in this volatile climate, there is concern about what happens next. John Snow, News at 10, Tehran.
Today, with Ayatollah Khomeini's continuing illness, President Bani Sadr has been invested with the greatest power any Iranian has had since the hostage crisis began. He's using it to search for an international solution, probably based on the UN scheme to set up a commission to look into the ex-Shah's activities. But he's using it too to drive a wedge between the students and the people. But how the students' still hardline views can be married with the evident diplomatic progress is still the question. John Snow, News at 10, Tehran.
This was John Graves, pictured at his post in the State Department just before he left for Iran. The terrorists have since released this photograph showing him in captivity. His hair and beard are visibly greyed. Mr. Graves' family has grown increasingly impatient with the way President Carter is handling the crisis. They want a congressional inquiry into America's Iranian policies.
My feeling is, as far as is concerned, that there's just too much evidence that is really available to public consumption that leads us to doubts. You know, there's been no disavowal of U.S. indifference to torture and murder committed under the Shah's regime, which is something that I, as a Christian and as an American citizen, cannot accept. And I think that is one thing that should be verified.
You know, I don't have all the answers, but I have been keeping well enough informed to know that I'm not being told the whole story, and that my situation making.
Does that make you angry?
Yeah, that makes me angry, because I have the right to know, and that's our whole system is built on that. We have the right to know.
What worries me in this situation is that for some reason it appears to be a sin suddenly in the United States, a sin to question. That's what worries me.
Mrs. Graves has received only 3 letters from her husband since his capture 150 days ago, but she's convinced he will be surviving his ordeal well.
Oh, my personal feeling is, but then of course maybe after 32 years of marriage, maybe I'm rather prejudiced, but I'm certain that he's there helping others. He's a very strong person. I'm certain that he has the kind of sense of humor that will find something to laugh about in any situation, and I'm certain that he certainly has been using it.
At a cemetery in Hermitage, Pennsylvania, an American flag is raised to mark yet another day in which U.S. hostages are held captive. It's a ceremony that's been held here since day one of the Iranian crisis. This field of flags in this one small town is a poignant symbol of the frustration and anger Americans feel about events in Iran. A reminder to Europeans, if one is needed, that this is an issue that has touched people here like no other in this decade. Newspapers here carry every twist and turn of the story and have had a response in letters from readers unparalleled in their history. Letters that demand everything from dropping nuclear bombs on Iran to arresting every Iranian living in America. On Capitol Hill, politicians have been returning from their Easter recess this week, having heard during the holiday from their constituents. The mood clearly is for stiffer action against Iran, and there's the expectation, indeed the demand, that European nations throw in their support.
It just seems to the average Kansan that we ought to keep the pressure on, real pressure. We ought to be talking to our friends around the world and get them to put on some pressure. And everything else fails, then we impose a blockade. We shut down the economy of that country, and then maybe they'll talk about releasing the American hostages.
Now, do you think that, that a military option should be undertaken?
That depends on the response of the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and our principal allies. If they'll back us up, hopefully that can be avoided.
Do you expect full backing from the Europeans?
I think that they will back us. I certainly hope so. We've always backed them. Now we need their help.
At Washington's National Cathedral, there's a service that takes place every hour on the hour. A quiet vigil in which prayers are said for the release of the hostages and the comfort of their families. The prayers also say this:
Guide the leaders of our nations with your counsel and restrain the passions of the people, so that bloodshed may be averted and peace preserved.
Norman Reese, News at 10 in Washington.
And the nations of the earth may dwell together in true and lasting peace, with liberty and justice for all.
You have to get a fair way away. Leave.
It's still early to assess the long-term effect of this incident on Iranian opinion, but already it's clear that there's a further disliking of Westerners in general and Americans in particular. And as for the hostages inside the embassy, well, it won't have improved their chances. Jon Snow, News at 10, Tehran. The Iranians are still unwilling to allow any Westerners anywhere near the crashed helicopters and aircraft. They fear that there is a possibility that the area is still booby-trapped, and they fear that locals who have been told that there are still Americans in the area might mistake British journalists for those Americans. The landing site the Americans chose was through the mountains out in the flat, remote desert beyond, 10 miles from habitation. But across it runs a road upon which perhaps a dozen vehicles pass each hour. We travelled, as did the only Iranian witnesses to what happened last Thursday night, by bus. 2 or 3 buses a day run the 14 hours from Tabas to Yazd. The Americans seem not to have anticipated that one would pass whilst they were here. The passengers arrived before the rescue attempt burst into flames. They were ordered from their bus around 9:30 in the evening and were then to observe at close quarters what the world has argued about ever since. The helicopters appear to have landed first. 6 of them, no evidence of more. Beside each, a telltale stack of empty cans revealed that their occupants had had time for a meal. Inside the belly of one helicopter that remained intact, guns, bullets, first aid, camouflage, radio equipment. Outside, refueling pumps, but no sign of lights to guide other craft down. After the helicopters had landed, but before the inferno, a tanker moved towards the landing site. We met its driver, who we found inspecting what had been his vehicle. He explained he'd been driving when he heard a gunshot, felt the bullet hit his tanker. Then something hit his front wheels and he stopped. Then he saw 2 men in combat jackets, Americans, on their bellies moving with guns. A bullet shattered his windscreen, the glass cutting him about the eye. He jumped from the tanker as it burst into flames. It appears he had met an American outpost several hundred yards from the landing site. They'd sought to use his flaming truck as a roadblock to discourage other traffic. He then ran away, never saw flames in the distance, and put the time at 10:30 last Thursday night. The crash happened later. It was to result in the devastation of one of the massive transport planes and one of the helicopters. This is the core of the tragedy. First impressions might suggest that this is simply the wreckage of the giant C-130 transport plane. But this is the entire rotor assembly of one of the American helicopters that were involved in the rescue attempt. It was parked over here, and it was when it took off on a mistaken bearing that it sliced into the Hercules plane. That, at least, is the version that has flowed from America in the past few days. But a combination of factors that we found suggested the possibility that the Hercules had in fact ploughed into the helicopter. The ruts left behind in the aftermath of landing appear to have swerved to miss another helicopter. The reverse thrust of the plane's huge propellers blowing sand forward around the cockpit in pitch darkness may have persuaded the pilot that he'd passed the last helicopter. The propellers on the impact side are in smithereens, as if they hit something static whilst still in motion. Yet the helicopter blades are practically intact, suggesting they were not rotating. The molten aluminium marked the intense heat of the blaze which followed, so intense that no American could get near to drag clear the bodies in the wreckage. The strong implication that this plane had brought the helicopter's lifeblood, without which now the mission was doomed, the fuel. 100 yards away, the only other tracks left by a plane, those of another Hercules, the plane by which the Americans were now to escape. There was no sign that any other craft landed. Only 2 planes and 6 helicopters here then. So what happened to the others? Did they land elsewhere? Amid frantic moves to leave, the Americans splashed jet fuel on their grounded craft. They fired into some of them. 3 caught fire and were totally destroyed. 2 survived. 1 was even started by the Iranians themselves late last night. The bus people they let go. These terrified country folk fled the blaze, their worldly possessions left in a heap beyond the carnage. And the Americans, crammed desperately into the belly of one surviving plane, lifted off, comforting 4 desperately burnt compatriots, abandoning a scene of utter hopelessness, and leaving behind any chance of rescuing 50 hostages held 400 miles beyond these desert wastes. John Snow, News at 10, at the American crash site in Iran.
Mr. President, what would you do now about Iran and the hostages there?
It's a terribly tough call because first, the rescue operation now is not possible since the militants have moved the hostages to various places in the country. The military option does not apparently appear in the cards in view of this one having failed, although I would not rule it out. You must always keep them guessing. Economically, we ought to keep the squeeze on. and I hope our European allies, and particularly the British, have been very, very supportive, will help here. Down the road, if everything else fails, then we have to go the diplomatic track again. And I don't think the UN can do it. I don't know whether it can be done bilaterally between the U.S. And Iran. It may be that, who knows, that somebody like the British, who are pretty skillful at this sort of thing, might be helpful. Right now, though, I haven't any answer for it. It's a tough call.
Many people think that the Russian invasion of Afghanistan is more important and more serious than what's happening with the hostages.
It is. One thing about the hostage situation, it's a very, very great traumatic experience for them, for their families, and for Americans who don't like to see that. But unfortunately, too many Americans are concentrating on 50 Americans that are being held and not on the bigger picture of what is happening to the United States and the free world and other areas. What's happening in Afghanistan, what could happen in Yugoslavia once Tito passes from the scene. The fact that the Soviet Union is now acquiring nuclear superiority over the United States. These are the issues that ought to be discussed rather than the hostage issue alone or primarily. And I think that therefore it's very important for us to do what we can to have some way to resolve the hostage issue so that we can concentrate on these other issues that are really far more profoundly important to us and to the Western Alliance.
And if after Iran, Saudi Arabia were to look like falling apart, what policy would you suggest the West should follow?
Well, here you can't talk about economic activities against any government that might come there that would be hostile to the West or not dependable. You can't talk about taking it to the United Nations and slapping on the wrist with one of those meaningless kind of resolutions. There's only one thing to do. The West cannot get along without Saudi Arabia's oil. So we move in. The U.S. should move alone, preferably with allies, and I would hope they would join, if not alone, because that supply is essential to the West. I would say in that respect, if the West should lose the supply of oil from Saudi Arabia, it would bring a depression and a recession in Japan, in the Federal Republic of Germany, not in Britain, fortunately, because you have the North Sea oil.
But you would say, therefore, direct military help to the present government in Saudi Arabia?
Absolutely. In the event that Saudi Arabia is threatened by external aggression or by an internal revolt supported by somebody externally or otherwise, and that government, as it would not be able to because their army just isn't up to it, they have the money but they don't have the men, the trained manpower. If they cannot handle the situation, then the U.S. and our allies should go in and help them militarily. We should commit our forces and take the risks that are involved. We cannot allow Saudi Arabia's oil to come into hostile or undependable hands.
Thank you very much.
The West's obsession with trying to win the release of the hostages has totally obscured the very real dangers to world peace posed both by the search inside Iran for regional autonomy and by the growing risk of conflict between Iran and Iraq. The effects of the Americans' abortive attempt to lift the hostages out of here seem to have been to consolidate the position of those who continue to hold the hostages and to make it all the more difficult to find any peaceful solution to the crisis. John Snow, News at 10, Tehran.
At the head of the march, a group carrying the Stars and Stripes, urging fellow Americans along the way to join their counter-demonstration. The 300 Iranians were heavily outnumbered by police. Chanting "Long live Khomeini," they walked slowly through Washington's business district, surrounded on all sides by angry Americans. But police hustled away anyone who tried to impede the march. Washington police sum the situation up like this. Every demonstration has one or two screwballs who want to disrupt it. But these are mainstream Americans here, hundreds of them, and they'd all like to see this demonstration broken up. Opposite the White House, where the march was due to end, mounted police were called in to keep the two sides apart. The Iranians were protesting about alleged police brutality during a similar demonstration 11 days ago. A small group just released from police custody were escorted through the crowds to join the demonstration. Encircled by police and by several hundred angry onlookers, the Iranians ended their demonstration with prayers. It's not clear whether any were said for the American hostages now in their 278th day of captivity in Iran. Norman Rees, News at 10 in Washington.
Flag's new headquarters, the delay comes as a double disappointment. Thousands of cards and parcels addressed to the hostages had been deliberately held back in the expectation that they'd be released before Christmas. This latest upset has caused the group's staff of volunteers, including Mrs. Louisa Kennedy, the wife of hostage Moorhead Kennedy, to put in long hours attempting to reassure the families.
So just go about what you want to do for Christmas, and don't worry, if anything comes up, we'll be on the phones to you.
Mrs. Kennedy is spending the festive season at her Washington home with her 4 sons. She says that in some ways this Christmas is easier than the last.
Perhaps by this time we've realized the immensity of the problem, or at least it's been with us for a terribly long time. At the same time, we have sort of prepared ourselves over the year for the eventualities that come seemingly with great regularity now, that one holiday and then another passes us by, and our hopes are raised and our hopes are dashed again, and still there isn't a solution to the problem. But I think we'll all get this all right.
I've heard it said that in a strange sort of way, members of the hostages' families have felt drawn closer to their loved ones during this type of occasion.
I think that's very true, because a festival like Christmas, or one that's just gone by like Thanksgiving, are generally days in a family's life which are filled with tradition, filled with events that happen year after year. And in that sense, the hostage will know exactly what's going on at home, who's apt to be at the gathering, what the tone is going to be, what the toasts will be, or whatever. And in this way, we don't need conventional communication.
The White House Christmas tree remains unlit as a tribute to the 52 American hostages. Ironically, Mrs. Louisa Kennedy wanted all the lights turned on as a symbol of hope. She remains confident that 1981 will bring the release of the hostages. Andrew Mandelstam for News at 1, Washington.
Behind me here in the Bank of England, an account has been opened in the name of the government of Algeria. That account and this building is tonight the focus of some of the most feverish activity the banking world has ever known, and it is the key to whether or not the hostages will be freed. The account is to be used to assemble all the Iranian assets from perhaps a score of banks across the world, and it is to constitute the American down payment for the release of the hostages. What is happening here tonight would, under normal circumstances, take months to transact. But the American and European banks have taken the unprecedented measure of waiving all normal banking restrictions. The whole process could take hours to complete.
No, this is Nancy. Okay. Here in Washington, they're parading for President Reagan. But the news is that former President Carter will soon be back here again from his home in Plains, Georgia, to see his old Secretary of State, Mr. Muskie, and other friends, and fly with them to Germany to see the hostages tomorrow. The Carter people are very bitter. They say Iran deliberately prevented Mr. Carter from achieving his last and dearest wish, to see the hostages before he left the White House. President Reagan says he only heard the hostages were on their way shortly after he'd finished his inaugural speech here at the Capitol.
Well, it was extremely exciting and very moving to feel, after all these detailed financial negotiations conducted in the abstract, in small rooms, dealing with legal terms, suddenly one saw what it was all for, and out came the people, and one was able to talk to them, and it was very exciting.
It was a very exciting moment when we saw the hostages come down the steps of the aeroplane. It was pouring with rain, but somehow one took no notice of that at all.
He was obviously exhausted, but at the same time buoyed up by the success of the very, very complicated negotiations.
Was he able to make any comment at all on exactly what the last-minute hitch or hitches were?
No, we didn't have, first of all, I probably wouldn't understand well enough, not having been involved or that close to it. He simply went out of his way to say that Kit McMahon, the deputy governor of the Bank of England, had been immensely helpful and valuable. And he said he'd never seen so many dollars worth of assets toted up.
It must have been a particular poignant irony for President Carter that the hostages were eventually released so soon into the new presidency.
Sure, but I don't think that was manipulated, nor do I think that that mattered anywhere near as much to President Carter as the fact that it was successful, because it was his policy to freeze the assets and to use the assets frozen along with sanctions as a bargaining weapon in order to avoid the resort to much more risky military action. And there were a lot of people along the way, of course, who, terribly frustrated, impatient, were asking for more bold action, but I think it was his restraint and his patience coupled with his early freezing of the assets which made all of this possible.